Tim Hortons is a coffee chain that's basically Canada in a cup. Politicians campaign there. Immigrants adopt it as a symbol of their new homeland. And a chicken in New Brunswick crosses a road every day just to hang in the parking lot. And with all that going on, you'd think they'd be sitting pretty. But not so much. Which is why today we're going to figure out everything that went wrong for Tim Hortons. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History Food channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what other donut shops you would like to hear about. Now pour yourself a cup of Canadian Java and grab a Canadian donut, because we're skating in. The story of Tim Hortons begins the same way most Canadian stories start, with hockey. Miles Gilbert Tim Horton was born in Cochrane, Ontario in 1930 and spent 24 seasons in the NHL. He most famously played as a defenseman for the Toronto Maple Leafs and was known for being one of the strongest players in the league. Seriously, he was the kind of guy opponents did not want to mess with, since fighting him was less like an ordinary hockey throwdown and more like Rocky avenging Apollo. When your career involves regular contact between your face and a puck traveling 100 miles per hour, the restaurant business is not usually the next logical step. Tim, however, was already thinking about what he'd do after his hockey days were over and had long dreamed about getting into the food service industry. So when he met Montreal businessman Jim Sherrod, who owned a donut shop, it turned out to be a match made in heaven. The two formed Tim and Jim Limited, a name that suggests they were considerably better at hockey and donuts than branding. And together, they opened 4 burger and chicken joints in Ontario. While those first places did do well, things really got cooking on May 17, 1964, when the first Tim Hortons opened in Hamilton, Ontario. Coffee was 10 cents a cup, and there were only 2 kinds of donuts, apple fritters and Dutchies, which are yeast-raised donuts with raisins. And that was it. No seasonal menu, no oat milk options, no limited edition hockey puck donut. Just 2 donuts and a cheap cup of joe, served by a man who could bench press most of his customers. It was perfect. The chain's name, however, went through some evolution. First, it was Tim Horton Donuts, then Tim Hortons, and then they dropped the apostrophe and it became Tim Hortons. Why drop the apostrophe? Because the Canadian French get cranky. And in 1993, Quebec's language laws made the possessive apostrophe technically illegal on French language signage. So Tim Hortons it was. Anyway, because even Canadian cops love their donuts, in 1965, a former police constable named Ron Joyce took over a location at 65 Ottawa Street North. He then opened 2 more locations, and by 1967, Joyce and Horton were full partners. It was, by all accounts, an ideal pairing. Horton had the fame, and Joyce had the operational intensity to actually build a chain. By the early 1970s, Horton was hearing more than a who. He was hearing cash registers ding.
It's usually when the ground falls out from underneath your feet.
You could be more right than you know.
On February 20th, 1974, Tim Horton was playing for the Sabres and lost 2-4 against his old Maple Leafs teammates. After the game, he got in his car to drive back to Buffalo. And in the early morning of February 21st, traveling at speeds upwards of 100 miles per hour, Tim lost control on the QEW in St. Catharines, Ontario, and was killed instantly at age 44. It wasn't until 2005 that the details of his autopsy were finally made public, and it was revealed that he had more than twice the legal limit of alcohol in his system. He was also taking a prescription drug called Dexamol. So the real cause of the accident was speed, alcohol, and, well, speed. After that went public, Tim's photo was quietly removed from every Tim Hortons location. It took until 2014 for a public movement to push for them to go back up. Opinion remains split, and the chain named after the Hall of Famer has never quite figured out what to do with the fact that its founder was a complicated figure. After his partner's death, Ron Joyce wrote a check for $1 million and bought out the Horton family's shares, becoming the sole owner of 40 locations, which in retrospect may be the greatest real estate deal in Canadian history. It's like buying Manhattan for beads, except the beads were donuts. and the Manhattan was eventually 500 locations by 1991. From there, Joyce's expansion strategy was so aggressive it drove most independent donut shops and small chains completely out of business. Canada's per capita ratio of donut shops became the highest in the world, beating out every other nation on earth in a competition most of them did not even know they were in. Ron Joyce didn't just build a coffee chain on Tim Hortons' name, he built a monopoly with sprinkles on top. At its peak, Tim Hortons wasn't just a restaurant, it was a Canadian institution, the kind of thing that gets described with the same reverence usually reserved for hockey and universal health care. In 2016, Canada ranked first out of 80 countries for coffee consumption at food service locations, which sounds impressive until you remember that Canadian winters are essentially a war crime against the human body, and hot coffee is survival equipment. This was all thanks to Tim Hortons, since there was one location for every 9,000 Canadians. For comparison, there was one McDonald's for every 25,000. So Tim Hortons wasn't just omnipresent, it was infrastructure, like roads, but with a warm glaze. The cultural weight was real. Canadian author Pierre Burton wrote that, "In so many ways, the story of Tim Hortons is the essential Canadian story, a story of success and tragedy, of big dreams and small towns, of old-fashioned values and tough-fisted business, of hard work and of hockey." When immigrants arrived in Canada, they adopted Tim Hortons as a symbol of their new homeland. Politicians running for office made Tim Hortons stop some mandatory campaign ritual, which became the Canadian equivalent of kissing babies, except that the babies are donuts. The term Tim Hortons voter entered the political vocabulary the same way soccer mom did in the United States. A coffee chain became a demographic. The devotion ran so deep that in 2016, CBC News reported on a New Brunswick chicken who crossed the busy street every single day to spend time pecking around a Tim Hortons parking lot. She'd show up every afternoon at around 1 p.m., get her daily Timbit crumb fix, and wander back home. This actually made the news. And if that doesn't tell you what the Tim Hortons brand meant to Canadians, nothing will. Heck, even the marketing was beloved. Roll Up the Rim was the annual campaign where customers peeled back the rim of their cup to reveal prizes ranging from free coffee to cars. And it became so culturally embedded, it was essentially a fifth season of the year. Roll Up the Rim ran from 1986 until it went fully digital in 2020. Surviving recessions, 2 ownership changes, and one incident so unhinged it deserves its own true crime podcast. In 2006, a child found a cup in a garbage can. She couldn't roll the rim herself, so asked for an older girl to help. When the prize turned out to be a Toyota RAV4, both families lawyered up. Tim Hortons had to issue an official ruling, like a tiny coffee-scented Supreme Court. And in a decision that would make any Canadian proud, they went with the Finders Keepers ruling, and the younger girl's family won. So with things flying high at Tim Hortons, you have to ask, what happened? It started, as many Canadian tragedies do, with an American. In 1992, a franchisee in Prince Edward Island who owned both Tim Hortons and Wendy's locations decided to open a combo store. The owner invited both Ron Joyce and Wendy's chairman Dave Thomas to the grand opening. Thomas was so impressed that on August 8, 1995, Wendy's International acquired Tim Hortons in a deal worth $580 million. A quintessentially Canadian institution was sold to an American burger chain. The Toronto Star called it the spectacle of another great Canadian icon gone to Yankee burger fat, which remains one of the greatest sentences ever written about a donut company. Canadians were unhappy, which says a lot for a people known for their politeness. The merger did help Tim Hortons surpass McDonald's as Canada's largest food service operator, which was genuinely impressive. Unfortunately, though, the damage to the brand's Canadian identity was real, and it did not go away. The two companies stayed merged until 2009, when Wendy's spun Tim Hortons off into its own publicly traded company again. And Canada exhaled, apologized for the inconvenience, and went back to their coffee. That peace lasted until 2014, when Burger King, owned by Brazilian private equity firm 3G Capital, acquired Tim Hortons for an $11.4 billion deal, folding both chains into a new parent company called Restaurant Brands International. A Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives study warned the deal was likely to have overwhelmingly negative consequences for Canadians. If they weren't so polite, they'd be shouting, "Told you so!" from the rooftops. 3G Capital cut costs faster than a hockey player loses a tooth in the third period. It had done it to Burger King, Heinz, Anheuser-Busch, and Tim Hortons was next. Corporate headcount dropped from nearly 40,000 employees to just over 1,000. Franchisees, who now had to pay for required store renovations out of their own pockets, started getting squeezed from every direction. So to fight back, they formed a group called the Great White North Franchisee Association, which is an objectively incredible name for a donut shop advocacy group. In 2017, that association filed an $850 million class action lawsuit against Restaurant Brands International, alleging bullying and intimidation tactics, inflated head office pricing, and the misuse of $700 million in advertising funds collected from franchise owners. So you could see why the association was getting ready to throw elbows. Then in 2018, Ontario raised its minimum wage from $11.40 an hour to $14 an hour, an increase that brought in an extra $5,400 a year for full-time employees. Restaurant brands refused to help franchisees offset the cost. So some franchisees responded by cutting employee benefits and eliminating paid breaks. The franchisees doing this included Ron Joyce Jr. and Tim Hortons' own daughter, Jerry Lynn Horton Joyce, who got married and together were worth over $1.5 billion. So naturally, these Canadians looked at minimum wage workers making $14 an hour and said, "You know what? We simply cannot afford to let you sit down." These are people who could fund every employee's lunch until the heat death of the universe and still have enough left over for a backup yacht and a small island to park it near. Instead, they asked those employees to sign documents agreeing to give up their breaks and pay half of their own benefits. Around 50 protests broke out across Canada. If you're wondering how the whole thing went over with the public, in the Leger market research firm's annual ranking of Canada's most reputable companies, Tim Hortons held the number 4 spot in 2016. By 2018, they did a jackknife off a cliff and fell to number 50. And the hits just kept coming. Tim Hortons was named one of the top 5 plastic polluters in Canada in both 2018 and 2019, which isn't all that surprising for a company whose entire identity is built around a disposable cup. That same year, they introduced a new lid design that customers hated so much that they were selling antique old lids online for $200. Justin Bieber even got involved and posted an Instagram pool about it. 70% wanted the old lid back, but management did not care, and the new lid remained. In 2019, Tim Hortons decided the solution to their identity crisis was to add the Beyond Burger to their menu. Presumably because nothing says coffee and donuts like a plant-based hamburger patty. Customers responded with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for a root canal, and the Beyond Burger was pulled from most locations within months. In 2020, they also pulled a jerk move by refusing to offer sick leave during a global pandemic. And finally, in 2022, the Federal Privacy Commissioner found Tim Hortons had been tracking customers' location data 100 times a day through their app, regardless of whether or not the app was open. Canada's favorite coffee shop was spying on Canadians. How did they apologize? A free cup of coffee and a baked good. Guess they were out of RAV4s. Long story short, by 2022, Tim Hortons ranked 4th among coffee chains in Canada. The chain that once held 62% of the Canadian coffee market was now losing to McDonald's, Second Cup, and Starbucks. So where does Tim Hortons stand today? Well, the numbers are not great. In Q1 of 2025, same-store sales fell 0.1%, which fell short of analyst estimates of 1.4% growth. To put that in perspective, a Canadian company that once had one location for every 9,000 Canadians is now losing ground to an American burger joint run by a birthday party clown. The chain does, however, still account for over 40% of Restaurant Brands International's revenue, which means the Brazilian private equity firm that gutted Tim Hortons is now financially dependent on Tim Hortons recovering. The irony is so thick, you could spread it on a duchy. To their credit, the company is trying, which is a sentence that may have been unthinkable in 2018. But here we are. In 2024, they launched flatbread pizzas, expanded their cold beverage menu, and CEO Joshua Kobza announced a goal of growing afternoon sales to double digits. They have also stated, a mere decade too late, that they are returning to their roots. As one RBI executive put it, "While it's interesting to test burgers and cereal, it's not what we're famous for." Which pretty much makes everyone moan, duh. Internationally, with over 6,000 locations across 14 countries, things are actually looking up, which, ironically, is like a prophet who lost their followers but somehow kept their church. So, what's the moral of the story? Stop ignoring the needs of the people who made your company number one, eh? So what do you think? How would you rate Tim Hortons Coffee and Donuts? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from Weird History Food.